Well, let's go ahead and start this evening. We're close enough to 6:30. I think we can go ahead and begin. There's a few new faces today. Glad that you are here and joining us tonight and back from your trips and so forth. So we're glad that you're here. If you have not already picked up one of the workbooks, be sure to do so. And if you will look in there at page 10 this evening, you'll see that there are some questions at the end of each chapter, and those are the questions that are at the end of the chapter that we're going to be looking at this evening. Stephen is going to be playing his cello in just a couple of minutes. While he's playing the cello, I would suggest to you that you look over those questions, if you have not done so already, and either answer them verbally in your own mind, or maybe jot down a few answers to those while he plays, and meditate upon them while you listen to him. If you've not already read through the entirety of the book of Job, do so at some point fairly soon, and then in time for the particular weekly lesson, if you will then take a more close look at whatever the chapter or chapters are that we would actually be looking at. So like for next week, if you will look at Job chapter 3, that would be absolutely perfect. I put a sheet on your table that is in response to a question that Benita asked last week. It gives you, a half a dozen or so different Joban texts that are in other languages, non-Hebrew languages. You may want to take a look at those at some time. You may not want to. We're glad to have Stephen with us this evening, and he will play some Bach for us in just a moment or two. Last week, it was introduction to really Old Testament studies generally. We looked at who the author and the time period for the book of Job, and realized there really wasn't anything we could say much about either one of those two items. And then we spent some time looking not only at poetry, Hebrew poetry, what it's like and how it operates, but then also at the canonization of the Old Testament as well. So if you missed last week, in terms of the study of Job itself, you have not missed anything. So you're just in time today. Let's go ahead and pray, and we're going to jump right into it. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. God of justice and grace, you teach us to cast on you our burdens and heartaches. You know that when we believe we're not being treated fairly, we become irritated and short-tempered. If the unfairness continues, we're apt to take out our frustration on others, even you. Root out from us the tendency to point fingers. Teach us how to let go of our anger, that we, like Job, may entrust our lives more fully into your care. For Jesus' sake, amen. All right, Stephen.
Well, thank you. I want to say just a word or two before I play. There's almost nothing written for solo cello before the 20th century. I'm going to be playing, as Vaughn said, I'm going to be playing a little bit of Bach whenever I do play. And these were pieces written around 1720 by Bach, the great Lutheran composer. And to be honest, there's no connection that's at all obvious between anything Bach ever wrote, at least for solo cello, and Job. So what I'm going to play is little selections from these 6 suites that he wrote for solo cello. And tonight, I'll talk more about that later. But tonight, this is a Cerebon, which is a very, very slow French-influenced dance, not to be danced to, but rather a sort of stylized dance, which takes the rhythm and the emphasis on the second beat of the measure from the original, even older Cerebon. It's in 2 sections, each one is repeated. clap for you, church. Yeah, right.
Well, you'll remember, he was just to warm me up, that I'm serving as kind of the color commentary. So it basically means I can just kind of interject whatever I want. But no, all jokes aside, this is just kind of part 2, where we talked about theodicy, the problem of evil, a lot of things that at least a decent amount of scholars will say that the book of Job does focus on. Then we'll kind of hone in. Next week, I'll be much more in line with just looking at the text itself and just some of the areas where Bon and I differ on. Again, not right or wrong, just different. But before we get started, if you've got the questions, just shout them out. We'll see how much we remember from last week on the quizzes. Which one of these works of arts were not influenced by the book of Job? Yep, all of them. Trick question. The branch of theology that defends God's goodness in the face of evil is called? There. You guys were listening. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire is an example of generation. Job belongs in which of the following biblical sections? Right. And was Job a historical person?
Another trick question.
Yes. I say yes, Bon says no. So with that, is the main purpose of Job that of theodicy? And again, a lot of people will differ on that. And again, how does you correlate a loving, benevolent God when there is evil and suffering in the world? I mean, that is what some people will take away from the book of Job. And some people are very point blank. The book of Job is a theodicy. But there's been a decent amount of other scholars that have written specifically why Job has nothing to say to the puzzle of suffering. And again, people, a lot of times throughout, anytime there's something like, COVID, John Lennox wrote this book, just a small book, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And he answers some of these questions that, in a very similar way, plague Job. Again, we've seen recently with the fall of Afghanistan, the persecuted church. Again, we're not going to go into that, but again, not to differentiate Calvinism or Arminianism, but the free will aspect does come in there, of course. I mean, God, if he allows you free will, it is going to be a little bit of a square circle if there's not the possibility of evil. But again, most of this is just to start kind of thinking these questions over while we're going through this study. And to kind of tie that back into the world we live in, it was interesting that Bill Murray, earlier this year, he played and read the part of Job, and actually they did a call-in to where they looked at some of the problems plaguing the world, and it was just ironic, and it showed the sustaining and kind of timelessness of the book of Job in whatever era we live in. And just to read a little bit about that, against the backdrop of a pandemic's blight and wounds, a group of acclaimed actors on Sunday staged an online reading of a religious text with remarkable relevance to the current moment, the book of Job. Audience members may have been drawn to the production by the casting of Bill Murray as Job, the righteous man tested by the loss of his health, home, and children, but the real star was the format. Staged on Zoom, it was aimed at specific counties with participation from locals, including people of faith, and designed to spark meaningful conversations across spiritual and political divides. By using Job's story as vocabulary for a conversation, the hope is that we can actually engender connection, healing, and love, Duress said. People can hear each other's truths, even if they don't agree with all of them. And I think that's, again, in the day we live, just kind of to reiterate the timelessness of Job. And again, I promised you a part 2, a shameless plug toward apologetics last week, which again, apologetics is just derived from the Greek word apologia, meaning just speaking in defense of. So we're going to do a little logic, but I promise it won't be too boring. And again, people a lot of times say, oh, I don't like logic, I don't like philosophy. I think this is a pretty good quote. The man who claims to have no need of philosophy is the man most apt to be deceived by it. Because if a person says they don't need philosophy, that's actually a philosophical statement. So let's see if we can get this one right. I didn't actually test this, but I think it's right. This would be a deductive argument if premise 1 and 2 is right. Vaughn is taller than Pam. James is taller than Vaughn. If those two are true, 3 necessarily follows. Now you could say, well, no, James was on stilts. Well, then maybe not. But if 1 and 2 follow, then 3 also follows. So it's a lot of times whenever I am speaking it, the biggest question, like I said last week, that I get is that evil and suffering. Again, we're not going to go into a lot of detail here. I would just reference you to reasonablefaith.org, a good website that has a lot of videos on these that break them down really digestible. But again, with that same deductive mentality, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. So even if, and to put it another way, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Number 2, evil exists. There are some things that are really evil. Number 3, therefore objective moral values exist. Some things really are evil, therefore God exists. So a lot of times when a group will say, well, this is an argument against God. Well, no, not at all. And again, real quickly, objective moral values is just something that is right or wrong, independent of whether we agree that it is or not. If, for example here, if the Nazis would have won and every single person in the world said the Holocaust was right, well, if God exists, they're still wrong because it would have been an objectively wrong act. And that really is just kind of building on a foundation. And you'll see some atheists, Richard Dawkins here, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now what's interesting is he will acknowledge there's no right or wrong, but he spends a lot of time saying how bad religion is. And again, it goes back to that foundation, and I'll use a C.S. Lewis quote. My argument against God, this is when C.S. Lewis was an atheist before he converted to Christianity, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? So again, one thing that while you're reading through the book of Job, while you're thinking about coronavirus, Afghanistan, a lot of things is just taking solace in the fact that God exists outside of these. And again, real quickly, just to read this correlation of this Chinese graph, the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. One reason that the problem of evil seems so intractable is that people tend naturally to assume that if God exists, then his purpose for human life is happiness in the world. God's role is to provide a comfortable environment for his human pets. But on the Christian view, this is false. We are not God's pets, and the goal of human life is not happiness per se, but the knowledge of God, which in the end will bring true and everlasting fulfillment. Many evils occur in life that may be utterly pointless with respect to the goal of producing human happiness, but they may not be pointless with respect to producing a deeper knowledge of God. Innocent human suffering provides an occasion for deeper dependency and trust in God, either on the part of the sufferer or those around him. Of course, whether God's purpose is achieved through our suffering will depend on our response. Do we respond in anger, bitterness toward God? Keep that in mind while we're reading Job. Or do we turn to him in faith for strength to endure? And this graph just shows the miraculous number of Christians in China, just as a one example that was given here by the Patrick Johnston's Operation World. And what you see here is in 1950, there was roughly 500,000 Christians in China. Mao had a horrible basically an extermination of anyone with religious beliefs. He codified the language to be, I'm drawing a blank, Mandarin, thank you. And when that happened, and again, even the Chinese government are just aghast that from 1950, we went from roughly 500,000 Christians to today, it's estimated over 100 million. So again, a lot of times things are a little bit beyond the surface level. So again, as we're reading Job, I know you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. And I think that is going to be just an important piece to remember while we keep going through this study.
All right, so turn to your workbooks. You open your workbook up to page 5, I think it is. You'll see the text over on the left and a little place for you to add some notes on the right. If you want to take notes, do so. If you don't, well, just sit there and listen to me. But if nothing else, that will show you the pieces of the text that we'll look at sequentially as we work our way through. So we're going to start off by looking at the first 5 verses of chapter 1. Through most of chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's going to be this shifting back and forth between earthly scenes and heavenly scenes. We're going to start off with an earthly scene here in verses 1 through 5, in which we are introduced to the character of Job. As James said, I don't think that he's an historical person. I think he's a fictional character, as is his wife and all of the other persons in this text, that enables us to be able to explore a particular issue that we're going to have to work on as we work our way through the text. That's what I think. It's not what everybody thinks, but it certainly makes some things easier as we work our way through it. You'll see why that's so in just a moment or so. Today and next week, because we're only looking at 1 or 2 chapters, I'll be able to pretty well go verse by verse through the text. Once we get to the next week, where we're going to be looking at 11 or 12 chapters, all bets are off for that. We won't be going verse by verse unless you want to sit here for about 6 or 7 hours with me. And at that point, I'd be happy to go through verse by verse. But probably you won't want to do that. So we'll go a little faster during those weeks. All right, so if you've got the text, you can kind of look over at it along with me as we work our way through this evening. Verse 1 tells us that Job is living in the land of Uz, not the land of Oz, the land of Uz. And that's wonderful. It sounds like a particular location that we should be able to pinpoint. The problem is we have no idea at all where really the land of Uz was. There are a couple of possibilities. There is a southern Uz and there is a northern Uz. The southern Uz is in Edom. That's the land that will eventually be known as Idumea. It's from Israel, and if you can think about the Dead Sea, go south and go east a little bit, kind of on top of where the Sinai Peninsula is, and that's where Edom is located, and Uz on this particular thought is somewhere down there. The other idea, the northern Uz, is up on the Syrian border around where Haran is. And if you are an expert in geopolitical sciences in the millennia before Christ, well, then you should just have all kinds of bells and whistles going off when you hear Haran, because that's the crossroads. That's the ancient crossroads of that area where the great road coming up from Egypt hits the great road that takes you over into the middle of Mesopotamia. Haran is right there, and that's where Abraham spent a little bit of time with his father before he eventually comes on down into the land that God has given him, Canaan, or what we know as Israel. Who knows if either one of those two is where Uz is, or if it's somewhere else? We certainly don't. What is more important in that first verse is that Job is described using 4 terms. He is said by the narrator to be blameless. He has personal integrity. He's said to be upright. That is, he walks in close fellowship with God. He delights in obeying the laws of God as he understands them. He fears God. That is, he trusts in God. He loves God. He reverences God. He recognizes that he is not God, that he cannot be God of his life, that God is creator, he's creation, etc., etc. And that he also, number 4, is that he shuns evil. He's innocent. Now, not sinless. There's nothing in the text here that says that he's a sinless individual. There, of course, has only been one of those ever, and he hadn't yet lived at this particular point in time when Job is theoretically alive. So he's not sinless, but he is innocent or blameless. He's upright, he fears God, and he shuns evil. Verse 2 tells us a little bit about his family. He has 7 sons, and he has 3 daughters. 7 is one of those numbers of perfection. Lenny Dawson, the Hall of Fame quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, always loved to tell that he was the 7th son of a 7th son, and all the rest was history. Job has 7 sons, but also has 3 daughters, and if you add them together, that makes a nice perfect 10. And you're going to keep seeing 10 show up repeatedly in these early verses, and to some degree throughout the rest of the book as well. Verse 3 describes Job's wealth, how absolutely wealthy he is. He's the Bezos or the Gates, not this Gates, of the ancient world. He has, for instance, 7,000 sheep, and he has 3,000 donkeys. 7,000 and 3,000. Makes a nice 10. Well, the sheep, that's for clothing purposes. So he has this massive textiles industry, if you will. And the 3,000 camels, well, that's the ancient trade transportation availability there. Those are the tractor trailers of the 2nd millennia BC in the Middle East. So, it doesn't do you any good to have textile industries if you don't also have the trucking industries, the J.B. Hunts, to be able to get the stuff out to where it needs to go. He has 500 oxen and he has 500 donkeys. 500 and 500 makes 10. Well, he has those oxen. Those are used for farming purposes. Those are the tractors of the ancient world. And the donkeys, those are the beasts of burden. Those are the pickup trucks that you use to be able to transport around inside of the farm area, or the western horse, as we might want to say. And he has lots and lots, just unnumbered numbers of servants, which tends to cause some kinds of issues for us today because of chattel slavery in 19th century America. But we really need to leave some of that to the side. That's not what we're dealing with in Scripture when we talk about servants. It really is much closer to what we would today call employees. Now, not necessarily high-paid employees, but certainly employees. And if you think employees, you're much closer to biblical servants than chattel slaves would be. These persons are in charge of his home. They're in charge of cooking. They're in charge of his farm. They're in charge of his trucking industry and his textiles. They're the ones running everything, while he sits back and just takes care of the books at home. Well, he has a loving family, according to verse 4. His children, all 10 of them, regularly get together with each other to have these celebrations. Most likely they're talking there about birthdays that they would get together and celebrate with each other. And Job, verse 5, functions as, if you will, the family priest within his particular unit there. He's regularly sacrificing burnt offerings. Holocaust is the term in Hebrew for his entire family, just in case. I mean, he doesn't expect that they're necessarily doing something inappropriate at these birthday parties, but you just never know if something might have been said or done that was inappropriate. And so every time they have one of these, he will then have a burnt offering, just in case something untoward was said or done, so that the entire family will stay right with God. There's your family. There's the first 5 verses. We switch then from the earthly scene now to the heavenly scene, and now a couple of additional characters, at least important to these first couple of chapters, are introduced. In heaven, we're going to see God, and we're also going to see one of the heavenly beings, one that is called Satan. Well, as verse 6 opens, there is a meeting that is taking place. Actually, it's been called together by God to have God and the heavenly court, or the angels, or the heavenly beings, or the sons of God, whatever term you want to use here, for them to all get together to have a discussion. This is a council meeting of some sort that has been called. We have no idea how often God calls these in the book of Job, and it's really unimportant. But at this point, at any rate, there is a non-Zoom sort of meeting that is taking place. And there's an initial conversation that takes place between Yahweh. Incidentally, there's I didn't realize this until I'd actually had these books printed, but everywhere in chapter 1 and 2 where you see the word Lord, that word ought to actually be in small caps. If you don't know what that means, if you see in the Old Testament the word Lord in small caps, that is telling you that it's not just talking about a Lord, it's talking about God, and it's using God's proper name, Yahweh, or in the King James Version, Jehovah. And so rather than transliterating that, they just simply put the word Lord in small caps. And every single one of those should be small caps. And for what it's worth, which may not be much, but here is this non-Israelite, and yet the book opens up talking about Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, initially. So it's an interesting shift that's going on here. It's sort of like, I think, what Star Trek did in the 1960s, if you're a Trekkie. There were certain things that you could not really talk about, just like today, that you don't dare talk about with other people. You're going to get some grief out of it if you do. But Gene Roddenberry understood that even though we can't talk about it right now, right this moment, we can at least talk about it if we put it into outer space hundreds of years from now. And so Star Trek was able to have interracial kisses, or was able to have folks who were half black and half white, or half black and half white, and having the kinds of dialogue with each other that you could never have in America in 1967. So here you have this non-Israelite Job, but yet it's all opening up with Yahweh. So you could talk to the Jews about issues that weren't really permissible to talk about otherwise, because it was a non-Jew that we were discussing, i.e. Job. Well, be that as it may, there's an initial conversation in verse 7 between Yahweh and Satan. As these angels, as these heavenly beings are arriving, God seems to be interacting with them. How you doing? What you been up to? Where you been? And he has that same kind of a conversation with Satan, who then responds and says, well, I've been wandering all over the whole dadgum world doing what you told me to do, gathering information. And that causes God then in toward the end of 7 and into 8 to say, well, really, have you run across my good friend, my man, Job? You know, for instance, that particular person, he's blameless and he's upright and he loves God and he's just absolutely a perfect person. He's not sinless, but he's a great guy. And right there, you see that the narrator, it's not just the narrator's words saying those things about Job. This is God saying them about Job as well. So from this point forward in the story, we can't fall back and say, well, Job really wasn't that good. Because here we've got God saying the exact same thing about Job. So this is God's feelings about Job. By calling Job my servant, that just escalates it even further. If you work your way through the Old Testament, you will find on one hand the number of people who are called my servant from God's perspective. Want to guess who they might be? Abraham, Moses, and David, and now Job. That's pretty elite company to be keeping. So we've got a good character here that we're working with. Well, God has pointed out Job. Said, I take pride in this guy. He's really doing well. And Satan is just not the least bit impressed in verse 9. In fact, he insinuates that Job is not nearly as praiseworthy of an individual as God seems to think that he is. And that he has in fact declared that he is. And so verse 10 contains Satan's accusation. And it's really not so much an accusation of Job, it is an accusation against God. Take a look at that verse. The accusation is, well, of course he does all those things. You're the very definition of a helicopter parent, God. What's up with this? You've been holding Job's hand since almost the day that he was born. You've been buying Job's love. Well, of course he loves you back. What do you expect in a situation like this? And the specific claims that he makes here is that you have installed a hedge around Job. Well, this is a protective fence, if you will. It's a security fence. Or if we need something a little more up to date, this is a force field. Or it's divine bubble wrap that is holding Job in and keeping everything bad out. So of course Job has it all really good. And on top of that, not only have you put this hedge in place, you're gaming the system, God. You're manipulating all the kinds of outcomes that Job's having to deal with. You've overblessed all of his flocks, all the work that he does. There's nothing natural about it. Nobody can get as wealthy, as well-to-do as Job unless you're pulling strings back behind the scenes. You need to stop that. So the insinuation here is that God has been treating Job like no one else in the entire world, and that is absolutely unfair to everybody else. It's unfair to Job too, for that matter. And secondly, then, that Job would be an absolute fool to bite the hand that has been blessing him. Of course he loves you, God. What do you expect? Well, if we back off of that for just a moment and think about it, it might become pretty clear pretty quickly that what we as the readers should begin thinking is about our own relationship with God. Why is it that we love God? Do we love God for who God is? Or do we love God for the benefits that we receive from God? And if that's a little too vague, let's just make it a little bit more specific. If God didn't bless you in your life today, if God didn't have some kind of eternal benefits, i.e. heaven, available for you later, if all of that was not true, is not true, would you still love God? Would you still keep God's law? Would you still be a good person if there were not eternal as well as present benefits, as well as punishments? It's worth thinking about. You don't have to tell me, but you do need to reflect on that a little bit yourself. Why is it you love God? Well, so Satan then says, if you were to remove that hedge, if you were to get rid of it, stop protecting Job, just put an end to all the special treatment that you have been giving him, you'd find out really quickly that his praise is not really as sincere as you think it is. It's not really very heartfelt. It's just a response to all these extras you've been given to him. And intriguingly, verse 12, God doesn't lower the boom on Satan and say something like, how dare you say that to me, the omnipotent. What he does instead is effectively accept fully that which Satan has said to him. Because, in fact, that's Satan's job is to bring that kind of thing to God so that God knows and can act appropriately in light of the sort of information that he receives. And so God says to Satan in verse 12, all right, that's fine. If you think that that's the case, prove your point. I give you full authority to be able to remove the hedge that you think I've put there around him, get rid of it. And let's just see. Let's try it out. I think he's okay, but if you don't, fine. Let's see if that works. Only thing is, you can't physically hurt Job. Keep your hands off of him physically. And Satan agrees to that, leaves, and ostensibly when he leaves, it is to then go forth and carry out that which he has agreed to do with God. So let's step away then from the text for just a moment and let's talk about Satan before we go any further. Satan, incidentally, is going to disappear from the book of Job after chapter 2, but we've got to deal with him here in these first couple of chapters. I've written it this way because that's in fact the way it is written in Hebrew. It is Satan with a definite article in front. The Satan. And it is consistently that way all the way through the book of Job. In fact, it is consistently that way all through the Old Testament except for one place. Satan is not a character that you find actually very much in the Old Testament. He only shows up 14 times in the entire Old Testament. And 11 of those are in Job. There's one entry in 1 Chronicles and there are a couple in the book of Zechariah. What's most important for our purposes is to recognize that all three of those are either exilic or post-exilic writings. They are not writings that occurred early in Hebrew history. It's only somewhere around the year 500 or later that these writings ever appeared or even written. And so Satan is a late entry into Hebrew history. Does make a lot of appearances, you could say, in the New Testament, although almost half of those are in the Gospels. Most of the ones later on, Satan doesn't actually appear, it's just that the name appears somewhere in those other texts. All right, there's always this definite article in front of the word Satan, which lets us know that in the Old Testament, this is not in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, Satan is not a proper name. This is not Bob or Charlie or Beth or Susie. This is a job title. It is the Satan. Well, okay, so what kind of job is it that this person does? Well, in Hebrew, the Hebrew word Satan is the word for, does anybody know? Don't answer if you know back there. Does anybody know? This is the Hebrew word for lawyer. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoy that particular fact. It is the Hebrew word for a prosecuting attorney. That person whose job it is to dig up dirt on other people. It might even be better to say that this is an undercover agent. This is an FBI agent. This is the J. Edgar Hoover of the Old Testament, whose job it is to maintain dirt files on everybody so that when you need it, you can present it. So Satan is the J. Edgar Hoover of the Old Testament. Jews don't talk about Satan whatsoever in the Old Testament until you get to these late texts, which lets us know this is, in fact, a very late text as well, going back to something we talked about last week. Oh, and one other thing. The only place in the Old Testament where Satan turns out to be evil, in all these others, it's just his job. That's what he does. He's not paid to do it, but that's what he's there for. Only in 1 Chronicles 21 does Satan show any sense of being an evil creature. The only place in the Old Testament. So, based on Old Testament texts, you can't equate Satan with the serpent in the garden, or any other thing in the Old Testament. Those are New Testament ideas that come to the fore. But in the Old Testament, he's just a creature like you and I with a particular job that he's called to do. And in fact, he does it. All right, so let's move on. Now to verses 13 through 22. We leave heaven behind for a moment and return to earth, because that's in fact what Satan has done. He has come to earth to now fulfill what he and God have agreed. And so in this particular earthly scene, there is a description of the various and sundry losses that Job experiences, and there are many, and they are terrible. He's going to have everything wiped away that he has ever had or hoped to have. The text opens up in verse 13 talking about, once again, all of his children being gathered together for one of these gala birthday parties that the kids throw from time to time. And they're all gathered, incidentally, over at the eldest son's home for this particular party. Job, as is usual, is not there. He's back at home taking care of things that he needs to. When, out of the blue, verses 14 and 15, he can see one of his servants beginning to run toward him. Doesn't know why, but it's clear the closer he comes that something has happened that he needs very quickly to let Job know about. And when he arrives, he tells Job in almost breathlessly that his 500 oxen and his 500 donkeys have all been stolen. All of his tractors and all of his pickup trucks have been stolen away. He's lost all of them. His farm is kaput. And all the field hands, all the servants that manage all of that have been killed. And there's only one that has survived, and that's me, who was able to get away to let you know that. Before Job even has a chance to respond to this particular loss, they've been able to see another servant running toward them, who in verse 16 finally arrives, and this second messenger, just as breathless, begins to spiel out why he's there. He has a word to share too. Lightning has struck and killed all 7,000 of the sheep. The textile industry is gone, just like that, as well as all the servants who took care of the clothing industry in the ancient world. Only one servant managed to survive all of that, and that's me. And he doesn't even get the words out of his mouth before in verse 17, a third messenger very breathlessly is running up and finally arrives, and he tells them that there were 3 bands of northern Chaldeans who struck them, and they, in just that quickly, they stole all 3,000 of his camels. So now the trucking industry is gone as well. All the tractor trailers have been taken away, and all the servants, all the truck drivers are dead too. There's only one that survived and was able to get away, and that was me. And he doesn't even get it all out of his mouth before a fourth messenger in verses 18 and 19 arrives. And when he arrives and starts telling what has happened, he must tell Job that this great, massive, almost unearthly wind has struck all 4 sides at the very same time. All 4 sides of his eldest son's home. And he must tell Job that all 10 of his children and all of the servants that take care of his home, they are all dead. The home imploded. Only one servant survived, the one that came. Verses 20 and 21 give you some sense of how Job responded to, well, to call it a catastrophe is an understatement. Everything that Job owned, he has suffered a complete and utter loss. All of his equipment, all of his employees, his family, everything that he has loved and cared for and worked for, it is all gone in the matter of just a moment's notice. I don't know if you've ever experienced something even remotely resembling that, but if you have, you know that it's like a kick in the gut. There's just almost no way to respond to something like that. It's, at some level, it's like losing a spouse. It's like losing a war. It's like who knows what that you might relate to, but it's something that just completely wrenches your world apart. That's what Job has experienced, and so he responds to it, as you would expect him to in these verses. He has 3 physical responses that he makes. He tears his robe, he shaves his head, and he prostrates his self. It's the way that he acknowledges that everything that he has held dear in life has now been taken from him. But he acknowledges that all things ultimately belong to God. I am just a steward. And so, amazingly, in spite of all the loss that he has suffered, he, down in verse 22, has responded in such a way that the narrator is able to conclude that just as God knew, and unlike Satan suggested, Job is in fact, a blameless character. He did, if you will, pass the test. Amazing. That brings us back to another heavenly scene, beginning in chapter 2. There's a second meeting that takes place between God and God's heavenly court. The first 3 verses here, in verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, are, if you were to flip back to chapter 1, verses 6, 7, 8, they are almost verbatim. It's almost the identical words that are listed from that earlier meeting to this meeting. God calls a heavenly meeting together. All the heavenly beings are showing up. God's interacting with them as they arrive. Hey, what you doing? Where you been? How are things? What'd you see? And when Satan shows up, where you been? I've been out doing what you told me to do. What, did you run across Job? My perfect Job. Did you see him again? And that's when Satan begins to say some additional things over what he said the previous time. Now, incidentally, we don't know how long has transpired between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Not that it really matters, but we don't know if it's a day, a week, a month, year. Have no idea how long. But Satan's claim, this begins to show up in verses 4 and 5. Satan says that, you got me, God. I told you needed to get rid of that hedge, and you told me that's fine. But doggone it, you put up another hedge better than all the previous ones by sending me out and telling me that I couldn't touch Job's body. Well, of course he came through it in flying colors, because skin for skin. You'll let go of something that isn't as important to you to hang on to something that is important to you. If you are thinking about, well, what would I do if I have a fire in my house? What would I save? What would I not save? You're making a hierarchy of the things that you value and why. That's what Satan is saying here. That Job cares for his body himself more than he cares for any other thing, even his family. So by not allowing me to touch his body, well, of course he came through with flying colors. But you let me go back and touch his body, and I'll be able to prove my point. And God, interestingly, says, okay, that's fine. If you think I'm still functioning like a helicopter parent, I'll let that go as well. You can take away whatever you need to, but there's yet one proviso you can't go past. You can't kill Job. You can do whatever you want to him, but you can't kill him. Kill him, we won't be able to carry this conversation any further. And he assigns Satan, incidentally there, that he must now be the one who watches over Job. How intriguing. because God is the one who usually watches over us. Now it becomes Satan's job to do that very thing. I won't take that any further, but that's an interesting little sidelight there. So in verse 7, the very first part of verse 7, 7a, Satan leaves in order to be able to actually now do that which he and God have agreed. He's now going to bodily, physically hurt Job. So verse 7b through verse 10 introduces a new character whom we haven't seen yet, Job's wife. And so there's a bit, it's not only the verses that describe the illness, sickness, hurt that Job experiences, but also a bit of an interaction between him and his wife. Well, Satan strikes him and strikes him well. He has sores of an indeterminate sort all over him. Incidentally, theologians, biblical scholars, clergy, doctors have spent hundreds, if not thousands of years trying to determine what the heck it was that Job was suffering from, or what sorts of things Job is suffering from. I've actually read a list of 36 things that were wrong with Job, but we don't have any idea what Job suffered from. Now, there's that 36, I mean, that's technicians and scholars that as you work your way through the rest of the book of Job, based on what he says, I'm hurting, I'm itchy, my body's doing this, that, or the other, they've gone, oh, well, that's a sign of such and such. Who knows? Doctors say all kinds of things. But who knows if that's right or wrong? All we know is that Job has got it bad. But there are two things that we also know. There's nothing that he has that is contagious, and nothing that he has that is fatal. He doesn't know that, but we, the readers, know that, because that's the agreement that God and Satan had before Satan goes forward. So Job, not knowing that he's not contagious, has self-quarantined himself. He's not at home with his wife and the few servants that were right there with him that survived. He has self-quarantined. He's out on the dung heap outside of town. He's on the trash dump outside of town, because that way he's not going to infect or infest anybody else. But he's got it so bad, he's just finding bits of rubble to scratch himself, to take care of the itching and so on that he's struggling with. Who knows how long he's in this situation? There are some other texts regarding Job that I'll share with you in just a moment or two that suggest that it might have been decades that he was out there on the trash heap. I can't even imagine. But it might have, on the other hand, just been a few weeks. We just have no idea. You can make that be whatever you want it to be. Verse 9 introduces now his wife. She uses the words that God had first used about maintaining integrity. But in her mouth, the words sound sinister. She's actually all over his case for maintaining integrity. She essentially calls him an idiot, a fool, for maintaining his integrity, given all that has occurred to him, because obviously God did this to you, because anything that happens is ultimately God's responsible for. So what the heck are you still pretending to be righteous when God has treated you like this, rather than treating you with blessing as he has up to this point all along? And she even goes so far as to say, you need to go tell God to take a flying leap and just to, do whatever. And, granted, you do that. You say that to God. God's probably ready to smash you. So you're going to die as a result. But that's a whole lot better than living the way you are and letting God do to you what God has. Job's response, incidentally, because I think that Job is a fictional character, Job's wife is a fictional character too. So that lets us off the hook here in a whole lot of ways. And it's going to change the way when we get all the way down to 42, when the kids come back, you know, all that kind of stuff. But she's just simply a foil here, I think. She's a foil to be able to introduce another layer to the argument that is being built here in these early chapters about why it is that we love God, forcing us to have to think very carefully about why we do things or fail to do the things that we do of faith. And she has cut right to the quick and said, you know, if God's not giving you all the things that you want, why are you wasting time with God? We've said the same sorts of things, or things pretty close to it, most likely at some point in time in our life, or at least thought about it, or known people who have said, why should I serve that God? He doesn't do anything for me. Well, does God have to do something for you to love God? Or is God deserving of love just because of who God is? These are the questions that are beginning to swirl here in these opening chapters of the book of Job. Well, Job in verse 10 rebukes his wife, effectively says that she's acting out of folly herself. Her words are God-denying. We never once, he tells her, ever questioned any of the things that God gave us that we considered to be blessings. We received them gratefully. What possible right would we then have to receive something that isn't the kind of blessing that we think we ought to receive, that also comes from God? We receive all things from God as gifts, learning to understand them, at least at some level, as a gift. Doesn't make them right, doesn't make them good, but it means that we recognize that through the midst of those things that happen and the way they happen, that God can bring amazing goods out of them. Now, if we have lots of time, I could tell you about some pretty nasty junk in my life that wasn't very good, that living through, God never made it good, but God redeemed it and enabled some good to come out of it of an eternal sort. And I'd like to believe that if you've thought deeply about things in your own life, that it's probably that way for you too. Stuff that you would never have wished on yourself or any of your worst enemies, but having lived through it, you're able to say in an amazing way that might even surprise yourself, I'm a better person because of what God has done in the midst of this, which is a very different thing than saying that it was a good thing that happened to me. It's that God can do something good with even the most evil thing. Well, the narrator's conclusion at the tail end there really repeats chapter 1, verse 22, and essentially says once again that God was absolutely right about Job. He is a person of integrity. He did not follow his wife's advice. Job's wife, even way back when, has intrigued people. Those two little sentences is all that shows up. She will not reappear in the book of Job. But she so intrigued the ancient world that even when the book of Job is translated from Hebrew into Greek in what is known as the Septuagint, a version of the Old Testament, the editors expanded those two sentences for Job's wife and made it that long. She got to at least say a little bit more. Where they got this from, nobody knows. But there's the Septuagint version of verse 9 versus what you could see in your Bibles. And then also, there was even an additional book written called the Testament of Job. It is a pseudepigraphical work. Big word that just means that it didn't make its way into any kind of scripture, but it was a book that had to do with sort of biblical characters and somebody used a fake name to write it with. And in this particular book, which was written somewhere around 100 BC to 100 AD, they take 12 chapters to talk at great length about Job the person and Job's wife and the friends that come and visit. And all the questions that you have about Job and Job's wife and those characters are answered by the testament of Job. Just like all those other gospels that litter the early centuries of the Christian era, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or Thomas or whoever, or the Acts of Peter and Paul, there's just hundreds of those that for the most part haven't survived, but most of those are attempts to answer the questions that you're left with. Well, what happened when those donkeys and cows and other creatures were there when Jesus was born? Well, who knows? But there's a book that tells you what it was. It's a devotional book. Well, this is a devotional book that tells you a lot more about Job. All right, one last section. Job's friends, verses 11 through 13 in chapter 2. This is a transitional scene. It's really a setup for what we're going to be looking at for the next several weeks as we work our way through chapter 3 through through chapter 27. In verse 11, there are 3 friends who arrive. Now, again, we don't know how long Job's been out there on the trash dump. It could be a couple days, it could be a few weeks, it could be years before they finally arrive. They're called his friends, but we really don't have any real sense as to what that means. They could be close bosom buddies, they could be neighbors, they could be business associates. Any one of those 3 and a whole variety of other things could fit that idea of being friends. Incidentally, that testament of Job said that they were kings. They were established personages in their own territories. So that kind of gives a closer sense to the business associates kind of mentality. But more importantly, having learned of Job's troubles, losing his empire and losing his family, they have come to offer him consolation. So they really are his friends, his close friends. And there are 3 of them that are named here. There's Eliphaz, who's said to be a Temanite. Tells us something about the location, just the same way that Mary Magdalene, that's Mary of Magdala. It's telling us where she came from. So Eliphaz comes from Teman. Bildad, who comes from Shua, and Sophar, who comes from Naamah. Well, we don't know where those places are. So it's not really very helpful at all. I'll spend a little bit more time talking about those 3 characters and those locations, though, next week when we come back together. Verse 12, they are absolutely taken aback. They are aghast when they see Job. If you've had a friend who has suffered a terrible illness or been in a tragic accident and you have now seen that person for the first time since you saw them last when they were quite well, you may have been absolutely shocked by the change in their physical makeup. That's the sense that you got here with these 3 guys. They cannot believe how bad Job looks. But for the most part, they bury that inside of themselves so that even though they're horrified by the way that they look, they just simply join him to console him. And so they do the same thing that he did in these sort of established rhythms that you go through to show that you are actually weeping with another person. You do physically weep, you tear your robes, you sit in the dust alongside them. You join with. The same way that, if you get a call that so-and-so died, you go over to the home and you sit with them. You don't necessarily try to say anything or do anything. You just go and be there. It's not that words would have done anything anyway. You're just there for them, with them. In verse 13, that's what they do. 7 days. 7 days, they don't say a word. They just sit there, mourning alongside of him. That's how long you mourn for a notable person in the Old Testament. That's how long Joseph was mourned. That's how long Saul and his sons, incidentally, were mourned. It's also, if you know anything about Jewish customs today, that's how long a Jewish Shiva is after the death of an individual. Family sits at home and people come and join them for 7 days. You come, you don't say anything, you don't do anything, you just sit there with them. In fact, Jewish practices regarding death, not that Job has died, but it's like he has died. And so they effectively sit Shiva with him. Here's the lengthy list of practices that go on in an Orthodox Jewish setting regarding the death of a loved one. When I began reading about Jewish practices, it became clear to me very, very quickly how utterly pagan and lacking in godliness most of our Christian practices are. Bottom line is we ain't got many. You're just left on your own. When you die, you got to figure it out. I mean, not when you die, but when somebody that you love dies, you got to figure it out when you're left. What to do, how long to do it, where to go, what to say. Well, the Jews have it all very carefully laid out. Now, that doesn't mean that a non-practicing Jew is going to necessarily follow this, but in an Orthodox Jewish setting, here's what they do. From the moment that death is imminent until the entire year is passed, it's all very carefully choreographed with the notion that this will now walk you through, it's crass to say, the stages of grief, but it's going to walk you through step by step, enabling you to live the grief that you have, and then to begin to work through it and emerge from it, and then eventually to get back to life, living a deeper life as a result of what you've gone through, enabling then to help other persons go through the same. This book was a transformative book for me when a Jew dies. This particular author was a professor of sociology, and he writes about Jewish practices as a sociologist, but he also writes as a son who loses his father. Not that it was it was expected, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter if it's expected or not. A death is a death, and losing a father or any other person is a loss. And so he combines a son's perspective, losing a parent, with sociologists reflecting upon it. And it was moving, it was wrenching, it was just a wonderful, wonderful read that transformed how I thought about death. When my first wife died, this was the book that I immediately turned to again to walk my way through so that I could deal with that particular event. Well, all right, we've gone just a few minutes long, but there you go. We've started off in the book of Job. We've also laid a foundation reflecting at a broader level about some of these issues that are being raised about theodicy that James has shared with us. We're going to come back next week. We've got a special surprise for you, so don't miss next week. It's not a surprise that Stephen will most likely be playing. That's special and a gift. But there's something else that will show up next week as well, in addition to be able to thinking our way through chapter 3 of the book of Job. We're long, but any questions that you just got to ask before we stop?
Hey, Ron, who's the author of the book?
Heilman, Samuel Heilman, Heilman. It's not the only one like that that's out there. It just happens to be the one that I read, and so I think it's wonderful, and it is.
Real quick, is Bildad really the shortest person in the Bible?
I don't know. Why do you think Bildad is the shortest person in the Bible?
That was everybody's supposed to be like, but shoe height.
Okay, questions are over. We'll see you next week.
Oh, that'd be a good way to end.
Yeah.